I am looking at something that the mainstream defense press has almost entirely buried beneath ceasefire speculation and diplomatic photo ops, and it should be sending shockwaves through every serious strategic analyst watching this theater. I have spent the last 72 hours cross-referencing battlefield telemetry data, open-source geolocation footage, and classified adjacent intelligence assessments from 3 separate think tanks. And what emerges is a picture that is considerably darker than anything you are going to hear from a Western news anchor tonight. Here is what they are not telling you. While Washington and Brussels were congratulating themselves on sustained sanction frameworks and Kiev was being quietly pressured toward a negotiating table it didn't choose, Russia was doing something operationally significant on the ground in Kharkiv Oblast. It wasn't just more shelling. It wasn't just another Shahed wave. What Russia executed was a systematic, phased degradation of Ukraine's defensive depth in its second largest urban corridor. And it is now producing territorial consequences that the Western press is actively underreporting. For the first time since this war began, a Russian fiber-optic FPV drone penetrated the northern outskirts of Kharkiv city itself, 21 kilometers from the Russian international border, inside the urban boundary of a metropolitan area of over 1 million people. That is not a tactical footnote. That is a strategic statement. It tells you that Russia has now engineered a guidance solution that bypasses Ukrainian GPS jamming entirely, a solution that conventional Western electronic warfare doctrine had assumed would remain an insurmountable barrier for at least another 18 months. Meanwhile, Russian forces have seized multiple settlements directly along the Kharkiv international border corridor, and the artillery and drone preparation for what analysts are now calling the anticipated spring-summer 2026 offensive is already visibly underway on satellite imagery. Russia is not posturing. Russia is loading the chamber. And yet, the dominant narrative you are being fed is about peace talks in Florida, frozen asset discussions in Brussels, and whether Viktor Orban will eventually sign off on a loan package. None of that matters if Kharkiv's forward defensive line folds before summer. And right now, based on everything I am looking at, that is not a remote contingency. It is the operational trajectory. Stay with me. Because what happens in the next 90 days in this corridor will determine the trajectory of this entire war. Kharkiv Oblast is not simply a region on a map. It is a geographic choke point that the entire logic of Ukraine's northeastern defense posture is built around, and understanding why it is so structurally vulnerable requires abandoning the comfortable abstraction of a front line drawn in red marker on a briefing room whiteboard. The oblast shares approximately 270 kilometers of international border with Russia's Belgorod region. That border is not defined by rivers, mountain ranges, or any meaningful natural barrier that military doctrine would classify as defensible terrain. It is flat, it is agricultural, it is crisscrossed by road networks originally engineered for Soviet military logistics. The very infrastructure that was built to project Soviet power westward is now functioning as an infiltration corridor running in the opposite direction. Kharkiv city sits only 40 kilometers from the Russian border at its closest point. For context, that is the approximate distance between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. It is not a buffer. It is a proximity that compresses every tactical decision Ukraine makes into a reaction time that advantages the attacker, not the defender. Any asset, human, mechanized, or logistical, that Ukraine positions in or around Kharkiv is operating within range of not just long-range fires, but now, demonstrably, within range of fiber-optic guided FPV drone systems flying at low altitude through urban and suburban corridors. The terrain amplifies this vulnerability. The open steppe of northeastern Ukraine provides minimal electromagnetic masking for Ukrainian air defense systems. Radar installations operating in this environment generate prominent signatures. Concealment of high-value anti-air assets is operationally difficult. Western-supplied systems, including IRIS-T and Hawk configurations, must contend with the physical reality that the flat approach vectors from the northeast offer Russian strike packages optimized approach geometry. There is no terrain forcing a Russian munition to bank, climb, or expose itself to a lateral intercept geometry. It simply comes in low, fast, and direct. The Siversky Donets River, which runs broadly through the region, was once considered a natural defensive mooring. but its utility has been progressively degraded as Russian engineering units have demonstrated the capacity to rapidly bridge water obstacles under fire, a lesson brutally learned at Izium in 2022 and relearned since. The river is a psychological boundary more than a kinetic one at this stage of the conflict. Furthermore, the urban geography of Kharkiv city itself creates a doctrine paradox for Ukraine. Defending a major civilian population center with hard military assets concentrates force in ways that invite precisely the kind of saturation strike campaigns Russia has been refining since late 2022. Russia does not need to seize Kharkiv to achieve strategic effect. It needs only to render it uninhabitable, ungovernable, and logistically untenable as a command node, and the trajectory of current strikes suggests that is exactly the operational objective being pursued. The geography, in short, is not neutral. It is collaborating with the attacker. The specific operational architecture Russia is deploying against Kharkiv in this phase of the war represents a doctrinal evolution that Western military planners have been slow to formally codify, largely because acknowledging it requires admitting that several of the foundational assumptions underpinning NATO's electronic warfare dominance narrative are now operationally invalidated. Begin with the fiber optic FPV drone. The conventional FPV drone, the kamikaze quadcopter variant that became the defining weapon system of the 2023-2024 phase of this conflict, has a critical vulnerability: its radio frequency link. Ukrainian electronic warfare teams became proficient at disrupting RF-guided FPV drones by flooding contested frequencies with jamming signals. For a period, EW suppression meaningfully degraded the lethality and accuracy of massed FPV attacks. Russia adapted. The fiber optic guided FPV drone severs that dependency entirely. Instead of transmitting video and control signals wirelessly, these systems unspool a spool of fiber optic cable as they fly, maintaining a physical, hardwired data link between the drone and its operator. Electromagnetic jamming is irrelevant. There is no RF signal to intercept, no frequency to flood. The drone sees through fiber. The operator guides through fiber. The kill chain is electromagnetically invisible. The confirmation that a Russian fiber optic FPV drone successfully struck a vehicle on the M03 highway on the northern outskirts of Kharkiv city, flying approximately 21 kilometers from the Russian border, is not simply a data point. It is a proof of concept demonstration conducted at operational scale. It tells you that Russian forces have solved the cable management, obstacle avoidance, and corridor routing challenges required to fly a physically tethered drone through 21 kilometers of mixed urban and semi-urban terrain without severing the line. That is an engineering achievement with profound tactical consequences. Now layer in the mass strike architecture. In the February 25-26 overnight strike package, Russian forces launched a combined salvo of 420 drone airframes alongside 39 missiles, comprising Iskander-M ballistic missiles, Kh-101 cruise missiles, Zircon anti-ship missiles used in land attack mode, and Kh-69 cruise missiles. Ukrainian air defenses intercepted the majority. Approximately 374 drones and 32 missiles were downed. But the residual penetration, 5 missiles and 46 drone airframes, struck 32 distinct locations across the country. That residual penetration rate is the operational point. Russia is not launching these saturation attacks expecting 100% success. The saturation model is deliberately designed to exhaust interceptor magazines, force prioritization decisions that leave secondary targets undefended, and generate psychological attrition in both the civilian population and the military command structure. When Ukraine expends a NASAMS interceptor worth approximately $500,000 to destroy a Shahed 136 variant costing roughly $20,000, $50,000, Russia wins the cost exchange calculus on that engagement even in defeat. Multiplied across hundreds of engagements per month, this is a deliberate missile economy strategy designed to hollow out Ukraine's strategic air defense inventory. Meanwhile, on the ground in Kharkiv Oblast's border corridor, Russian forces have been executing a sequential settlement seizure campaign, taking positions along the international borderline and using them as forward staging points for subsequent advances. This is not a breakthrough operation. Russia is not executing a deep armored thrust in the Kharkiv direction. Not yet. What is happening is methodical terrain preparation, fixing Ukrainian defensive units in place with fires, suppressing Ukrainian drone operations with layered EW coverage, and advancing dismounted infantry and light mechanized elements into positions that will serve as launch rails for the anticipated spring-summer 2026 offensive. The chemical weapons dimension cannot be omitted from this tactical picture. Ukrainian prosecutors have formally documented the use of chemical agents by elements of the Russian 136th Motorized Rifle Brigade in Vovchansk, Kharkiv Oblast, a town that has been in near constant kinetic contact since mid-2024. The deployment of chemical agents in that specific area served a distinct tactical function, clearing fortified basement and tunnel networks that Ukrainian defenders had converted into resilient strongpoints. Conventional fires and FPV drone strikes cannot reliably clear a fortified subterranean position. Chemical agents achieve that clearance with a fraction of the ammunition expenditure. It is a war crime. It is also, from a cold tactical standpoint, an effective one, and its documented use indicates that Russian commanders in this sector are operating under a directive to secure terrain at any cost. The cumulative picture is this: Russia is using a multi-domain, cost-asymmetric strike architecture, fiber optic drones, saturation ballistic and cruise missile volleys, chemical agents, and deliberate forward staging to systematically disaggregate Ukraine's defensive cohesion in the Kharkiv corridor. It is working, and the frontline geometry is beginning to reflect it. The collapse of Ukrainian defensive depth in Kharkiv Oblast is not a regional military event. It is a macroeconomic trigger with cascading consequences that will register in London trading desks, Tokyo insurance actuarial tables, and Riyadh energy ministry projections before the average Western voter has even been informed that the front line has shifted. Understand the first-order consequence. Kharkiv is Ukraine's second largest industrial city. Pre-war, it housed a substantial concentration of defense manufacturing capacity, including tank production and repair facilities, electronics manufacturing, and aerospace components production. The systematic degradation of Kharkiv's infrastructure is not collateral damage. It is deliberate deindustrialization of Ukraine's wartime economic base. Every substation destroyed, every transformer facility struck, every logistics hub rendered non-operational represents a reduction in Ukraine's capacity to sustain a war economy independently of Western transfer payments. The deeper Russia drives into Kharkiv's defensive layer, the more of that industrial capacity falls either under kinetic threat or is physically evacuated southward, disrupting supply chains that European defense contractors are now depending on as they attempt to reconstitute NATO stockpiles. The second-order consequence runs through European energy markets. Ukraine's energy grid has absorbed over 4 years of sustained strikes, and by credible Ukrainian government accounting, every single power generation facility in the country has been hit at least once since February 2022. The grid is not simply damaged, it is structurally degraded to the point where cascading failures now occur independent of active Russian strikes, as was documented during the January 2026 moratorium period when blackouts continued despite a temporary pause in energy infrastructure targeting. A Kharkiv corridor collapse would accelerate Russian access to the Dnieper River Basin's northern approaches, threatening the remaining generation nodes that Europe has been quietly subsidizing and technically supporting to prevent a complete Ukrainian power grid collapse. A collapsed Ukrainian grid in winter conditions is not a humanitarian footnote. It is an energy shock that reverberates into German industrial output, Polish grid stability, and the natural gas spot price in Amsterdam. Third-order consequences reach global maritime insurance premiums and Black Sea trade flows. The Black Sea grain corridor, never fully secure since its original suspension, operates under a persistent risk premium that Lloyd's of London and its peer syndicates recalculate quarterly. A significant territorial deterioration in Ukraine's northeast, combined with the demonstrated Russian willingness to deploy anti-ship capable missile variants like the Zircon in land attack configurations against inland Ukrainian targets, signals to maritime insurers that Russia retains an undiminished willingness to weaponize the maritime domain. Premium escalation follows, shipping diversion follows, African import costs for wheat and sunflower oil follow. and the global food inflation that the IMF has been cautiously flagging since 2023 receives another upward revision. The fourth consequence is the most structurally significant for macro investors. The unipolar credibility premium on U.S. security guarantees is eroding in real time. The United States has, by all observable policy signals from early 2026, substantially reduced its direct military support footprint for Ukraine, lifting portions of the oil sanction framework against Russia and entering bilateral negotiations that Kyiv was effectively excluded from designing. U.S. allies in the Indo-Pacific are watching this with extraordinary analytical attention. The implicit lesson being drawn in Taipei, Seoul, and Tokyo is that a U.S. security commitment, even an informal one, is a contingent variable, not a fixed strategic constant. That perception, if it calcifies, drives every one of those nations toward independent nuclear deterrence consideration, accelerated domestic defense spending, and diversification away from U.S. Treasury exposure. The dollar's reserve currency premium is not divorced from American credibility. They are the same instrument. What happens in Kharkiv does not stay in Kharkiv. It prices into every risk asset on the planet. I want to be precise about the strategic dilemma this creates for Washington, because there are exactly two paths forward, and both of them are bad. Path 1, Washington re-engages. It reverses the sanctions rollback, restores the military transfer pipeline, and signals unambiguously to Moscow that Kharkiv is a red line. The upside is that it potentially arrests the Ukrainian defensive collapse and restores deterrence credibility with Indo-Pacific allies. The downside is that it hands the Kremlin a mobilization narrative, an existential confrontation with a recommitted America that historically consolidates domestic Russian political support and extends the conflict indefinitely. Washington escalates and risks a frozen conflict on terms increasingly unfavorable to Ukraine's long-term territorial recovery. Path 2, Washington holds its current posture, lets the negotiating framework proceed, and accepts whatever territorial concessions emerge as a fait accompli. The upside is a cessation of kinetic hostilities. The downside is that Russia absorbs a battlefield victory. The credibility of Western deterrence is structurally diminished for a generation, and every authoritarian actor currently observing this calculus, Beijing, Tehran, Pyongyang, updates their model of what Western security commitments are actually worth. Washington negotiates and loses the architecture of the rules-based international order it has maintained since 1945. There is no clean exit. There is only the least catastrophic path through a deteriorating situation. That is what I need you to engage with in the comments below. Which path does Washington take, and what does it cost? Give me your tactical assessment, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Tomorrow's briefing is going to be on something your portfolio manager definitely has not modeled yet.